Dazzling diamonds, sparkly sapphires, and priceless pearls. And their million-dollar hand-me-down?
What if the betrayal of a crown didn't come from rivals abroad or protesters in the streets, but from inside the palace walls themselves? That was the chilling possibility that exploded when whispers began spreading through Buckingham Palace. Priceless jewels tied to Queen Elizabeth II and even Diana, Princess of Wales, had vanished from the royal vaults. At first, the idea seemed absurd. The royal collection is one of the most secure treasuries in the world, guarded by tradition and reinforced by steel. Yet the whispers grew bolder. An emerald choker worn by Elizabeth in her youth, a sapphire brooch linked to Queen Victoria, and most hauntingly, Diana's beloved pearl bracelet were said to be missing. Not misplaced, not loaned, but removed without explanation. For Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense resolve, these weren't just ornaments. They were relics of her mother's reign, fragments of history that embodied continuity across generations. The thought of them disappearing under Camilla's watch ignited a fury that insiders described as ice-cold, not fiery. To Anne, this wasn't merely a question of jewels. It was a violation of memory, a betrayal of the legacy she had sworn to protect. And what made the whispers unbearable was the suggestion that the removals weren't accidents. The pattern was too precise, the timing too suspicious, and the trail too convenient. Each vanished jewel seemed to circle back toward one name, whispered in corridors with growing certainty: Camilla. Imagine the tension of that moment. Treasures that symbolized the monarchy's endurance, suddenly treated like commodities. The line between heritage and possession blurred. Could the very woman crowned beside Charles be undermining Elizabeth's most sacred legacy? Stay with me until the end of this story, because the answers Anne uncovered would not only shake her family, they would shake the monarchy itself. To understand the storm that was about to engulf Buckingham Palace, we need to step back and look at what these jewels really represent. They are not just sparkling trinkets. They are tangible fragments of monarchy forged in moments of triumph, mourning, and tradition. Each brooch, tiara, and necklace carries with it the weight of history. Stories whispered through centuries of coronations, state dinners, and family legacies. The royal collection, formerly held in trust for the nation, is distinct from the private jewels passed down through wills and personal gifts. Yet the boundary between the two has always been blurred. Elizabeth II herself often mixed personal treasures with state heirlooms, lending them for exhibitions or wearing them interchangeably. That ambiguity was manageable while she lived because her authority was unquestionable. But with her gone, the lines suddenly mattered more than ever. Among the most sensitive items were those connected to Diana. Her pearl bracelet wasn't simply a piece of jewelry, it was a reminder of her humanity, her vulnerability, her bond with William and Harry. The sapphire brooch she wore to public engagements wasn't merely decoration. It was a symbol of her enduring grace in the face of pressure. For the public, these jewels remain emotional relics. For William and Catherine, they are touchstones of memory. And for Anne, they form part of the sacred inheritance of her mother's reign. This is why the rumors stung so deeply. If jewels had simply been misplaced, that could have been explained away as administrative chaos. But whispers of pieces reappearing in auction catalogs abroad, described with uncanny resemblance to royal heirlooms, struck a nerve. This wasn't just a potential loss of property, it was a potential theft of legacy. The British public has always had a complicated relationship with the monarchy. While many admire the spectacle, others scrutinize every inconsistency. At moments of scandal, the line between loyalty and outrage can shift overnight. Polls have shown repeatedly that while people forgive eccentricities, they do not forgive perceived betrayal. And nothing feels like betrayal more than the idea of selling or mishandling national treasures tied to beloved figures like Elizabeth and Diana. Catherine, meticulous by nature, was among the first to sense that something was wrong. She had worn Diana's earrings to events, carefully chosen to signal continuity and remembrance. When they failed to appear in the vault, where they should have been catalogued, she quietly began asking questions. The answers she received were vague, evasive, or non-existent, and that silence was more damning than denial. For Anne, the issue was far greater than a missing bracelet or brooch. This was about trust within the family. If Camilla was indeed removing jewels without proper authorization, it was more than selfishness. It was a challenge to the moral authority of Elizabeth's legacy. In the House of Windsor, where image is everything, even the perception of such an act threatened the very foundation of continuity. As autumn settled over London, the stage was perfectly set for confrontation. On one side were whispers of scandal growing louder in corridors and tabloids alike. On the other, the stoic determination of Anne and Catherine, unwilling to let silence erase the truth. The jewels themselves had become more than objects. They were symbols of a monarchy struggling to define its future in the absence of its longest reigning matriarch. And the deeper the suspicions grew, the clearer it became that this was not a matter that could stay hidden in the shadows much longer. The first cracks in the palace facade did not appear through dramatic headlines or televised outbursts. They emerged quietly, through details so small that only someone paying close attention would notice. And Catherine, ever meticulous, was paying very close attention. Her first alarm came while reviewing archive photographs for an upcoming event, when she noticed that a sapphire and diamond brooch, one famously worn by Diana at a state banquet, wasn't logged in the vault records where it should have been. At first, she assumed it had been loaned out or sent for cleaning, but the official ledgers showed no such entries. The space where the return date should have been was left ominously blank. Then came the whispers among staff. A footman, recently dismissed, confided to a former colleague that he had once been instructed to deliver velvet-lined cases to Ray Mill House, Camilla's private residence. He swore he had glimpsed Diana's pearl bracelet inside one of them, gleaming under the lamplight before the lid was snapped shut. Another aide, still employed, noticed delivery slips marked authorized but bearing signatures that raised eyebrows. Camilla's, not the usual keepers of the collection. The coincidences began stacking up like a deck of cards. In Monaco, an auction catalog listed a Victorian emerald choker that looked alarmingly similar to a piece last seen on Elizabeth II. In Geneva, a sapphire necklace was described in language almost identical to palace records. These appearances lined up suspiciously well with the timing of jewels quietly vanishing from inventories. Catherine gathered each clue, her private notebook filling with dates, names, and fragments of evidence. To her, the pattern was undeniable, and when she shared her findings with William, his reaction was immediate and visceral. These were not mere trinkets. They were his mother's legacy, the tangible memories of the woman who had defined his childhood. For him, seeing them possibly treated as commodities was unthinkable. The outside world soon caught the scent. Social media sleuths began cross-referencing auction photos with images of Diana and Elizabeth. Hashtags like, "Where are the jewels?" and "Protect Diana's legacy" began trending, amplified by influencers who had never before cared about royal heirlooms. Memes compared the missing treasures to national icons, mocking the idea that such priceless history could simply be misplaced. Public suspicion hardened further when a poll revealed nearly 2/3 of Britons believed the jewels had been deliberately mishandled. Fewer than 15% defended Camilla, while the rest expressed uncertainty. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was outrage crystallized into numbers. Inside Buckingham, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Staff who had served Elizabeth loyally for decades felt trapped. Some admitted privately that they had seen items disappear without explanation, but feared dismissal if they spoke out. One archivist, after raising concerns about missing sapphires, found his position abruptly restructured. The unspoken message was clear: silence or exile. For Anne, these early signs were more than enough. She began to compile her own dossier, quietly requesting copies of shipping logs, monitoring auction catalogs, and listening carefully to staff who trusted her with their whispers. Each clue strengthened her conviction that this was not chaos but conspiracy. And here's where I'd like to bring you in. If you were in Anne's position, watching evidence pile up, seeing heirlooms of your mother and your nation appear in foreign auction houses, what would you do? Would you confront Camilla directly or wait for undeniable proof? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because the choices Anne made next would ignite a storm that the monarchy could not contain. By the time the emerald choker surfaced in Geneva, aligning perfectly with a gap in the Windsor inventory, the truth could no longer be dismissed. The first signs were not random. They were the opening notes of a scandal symphony, and the crescendo was yet to come. What unfolded beyond the polished walls of Buckingham and Clarence House was far more gripping than the calm, scripted images the public usually sees. Anne, hardened by decades of duty and sharpened by her mother's trust, was not one to indulge in speculation. She wanted evidence, and she was prepared to dig for it herself. The first step came quietly. Anne called upon a small circle of staff who had served Elizabeth faithfully: a retired equerry, a senior archivist, and a trusted former lady-in-waiting. They were not detectives in the conventional sense, but each knew the palace's inner workings, its inventories, its ledgers, its secrets. Together, they began comparing catalogs from international auction houses against palace records and shipping logs. The alignments were too precise to ignore. A brooch missing in March appeared for sale in May. A sapphire necklace unrecorded in April turned up in Geneva in June. Meanwhile, William and Catherine worked in tandem with Anne, though carefully aware that any open suspicion could trigger a war within the family. Catherine, whose sharp eye had first caught the anomalies, focused on photographic evidence, gathering side-by-side comparisons of auction items with images of Diana and Elizabeth wearing the same pieces. William quietly pressed senior staff for explanations, but the responses were evasive, always couched in vague references to routine appraisals and temporary loans. Then came the breakthrough: shipping receipts bearing Camilla's signature. These were not vague authorizations but explicit sign-outs, often marked under evaluation. Yet no records indicated the jewels had ever returned. More damning still, emails surfaced between a Geneva appraiser and a contact linked to Camilla's household. The descriptions in the correspondence were unmistakable. Anne confronted the evidence head-on. In a private meeting at Clarence House, she arrived with the documents neatly bound, her tone clipped and cold. Camilla responded with indignation, denying wrongdoing and insisting that any jewels she handled were merely being valued. But her protestations rang hollow, especially as Anne laid out a handwritten letter from Elizabeth II herself. In this private note, the late Queen had expressed her earnest wish that Anne oversee the protection of specific heirlooms, emphasizing that Diana's jewels, in particular, should never be removed from the royal collection without consensus from her sons. The weight of Elizabeth's handwriting was more powerful than any accusation. Camilla's reaction was sharp. She accused Anne of staging a vendetta, of undermining her position as queen consort. She even suggested that Catherine was manipulating the narrative to elevate her own role. But Anne remained unmoved. Those present described the exchange as one of the most tense confrontations in modern royal memory. Camilla fiery and defensive, Anne unyielding, her words laced with the authority of both sister and daughter of monarchs. Charles, caught in the middle, sat in silence. His face betrayed the torment of a man pulled between love for his wife and loyalty to his mother's legacy. At one point, he raised a hand to speak, but the torrent of accusations and rebuttals drowned him out. To intervene would have meant choosing sides, and that was something he seemed incapable of doing. Behind the scenes, palace aides sensed the institution itself was at risk. Leaks had already reached the press, feeding the fire of public speculation. If proof of Camilla's authorizations became public, the monarchy would face its gravest scandal in decades. Yet suppressing the evidence carried risks of its own. Silence, after all, was no longer protection. It was complicity. Anne, resolute, pressed forward. She secured additional testimonies from staff who had handled the transfers. Some came forward anonymously, describing velvet-lined cases carried discreetly at night, the hush of orders given without explanation, and the unmistakable weight of priceless jewels within. Each account added to the dossier, each page closing the gap between suspicion and certainty. What made the situation all the more combustible was timing. International media had already begun running speculative features. juxtaposing photos of Diana's iconic pearl bracelet with blurry images from auction houses. The resemblance was undeniable, and the narrative was shifting from rumor to fact. Hashtags multiplied, petitions circulated, and public trust in Camilla, fragile at the best of times, sank with alarming speed. For Anne, this wasn't merely about optics. It was about honoring her mother's command. Elizabeth's letter was more than a sentimental keepsake. It was a directive. By following it, Anne felt she was defending not only the jewels themselves, but the integrity of the monarchy. For Camilla, however, the confrontation felt like betrayal from within, an attempt to erase her just as she had finally secured her place beside Charles. The palace, long adept at managing scandal, suddenly faced a battle it could not choreograph away. The jewels were gone, the signatures were real, and the arguments had reached the king's study itself. What remained was the inevitability of eruption, and eruption was exactly what came next. For weeks, the scandal brewed behind closed doors, confined to whispers in drawing rooms and the hushed tones of aides too frightened to speak aloud. But palace walls, no matter how thick, cannot contain a story once it begins to leak. The explosion came on a Sunday morning, splashed across the front page of Britain's most notorious tabloid in bold letters that seemed to scream from the newsstands, "Camilla's secret vault exposed." The article was merciless. It detailed the disappearance of jewels from the royal collection, citing insider sources, shipping logs, and, most damning of all, a private letter from Elizabeth II herself. The letter, written in the Queen's familiar handwriting, named Anne as the custodian of her most treasured heirlooms and urged their safekeeping. To the public, it appeared to confirm what many had long suspected. Elizabeth had never fully trusted Camilla with them. Photographs accompanied the exposé. One showed Diana's pearl bracelet, long believed lost, juxtaposed with a nearly identical piece featured in a Middle Eastern auction catalog. The implication needed no explanation. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Outside the palace gates, protesters gathered with placards reading, "Return the Queen's jewels," and Anne was right. Chants of Catherine and Anne echoed through the crowds, casting them as guardians of legacy against Camilla the usurper. Social media erupted. Hashtags like Jewelgate, Camilla exposed, and Diana's legacy dominated feeds worldwide. Television networks seized on the visual contrasts. The BBC ran split screens. On one side, Anne solemnly carrying her mother's letter. On the other, Camilla brushing off reporters with a sharp nonsense when pressed about the jewels. The juxtaposition was devastating. Anne appeared dignified, stoic, the image of duty. Camilla looked defensive, cornered, even guilty. The scandal deepened when Prince Harry entered the fray. From California, he released excerpts of private letters Diana had written in the 1990s. In one, she mentioned her pearl bracelet being seen in Camilla's possession, describing it as a reminder of everything taken. The phrase electrified headlines. Diana speaks from the grave. For many, this turned suspicion into certainty. International media piled on. American anchors likened the saga to Watergate, dubbing it Jewelgate. French newspapers headlined Le Scandale des Bijoux Volés. German outlets labeled Camilla Die gestohlene Königin, the stolen queen. Within 48 hours, over 20 million people had shared or read the story online, making it the most viral royal controversy of the decade. Charles, fragile and torn, tried to intervene. Behind palace doors, he pleaded for calm, urging aides to shield Camilla from the worst of the storm. But the tide had already turned, and this time, even the king's word could not stem it. Even the most loyal courtiers privately admitted that the evidence was impossible to refute. When the queen herself leaves instructions, one insider confessed, how can anyone argue otherwise? Camilla's public appearances soon turned into gauntlets. At one charity event, a reporter shouted, "Did you steal the late queen's jewels?" Cameras caught her snapping, "It's rubbish!" The clip went viral within minutes, replayed endlessly with mocking captions and memes, portraying her clutching handbags bulging with stolen gems. Anne, meanwhile, emerged as the unexpected heroine. Without raising her voice or seeking the spotlight, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Editorials praised her composure and resolve, hailing her as the daughter who upheld Elizabeth's legacy. One broadsheet declared, "When silence would have destroyed the crown, Anne chose duty." For Catherine, the blow-up was bittersweet. The jewels she had worn to honor Diana's memory were now vindicated as treasures that deserved protection. Yet the monarchy she had married into looked more fractured than ever. Still, her calm silence and unshaken poise only deepened her credibility. In the court of public opinion, the contrast between Catherine's quiet grace and Camilla's visible strain was devastating. By the end of that fevered week, it was clear this was no longer a palace whisper. It was a global trial by public opinion. The jewels, once symbols of unity and continuity, had become emblems of betrayal and division. And at the center of the storm stood two women. Anne, branded the guardian, and Camilla, branded the thief. But the storm was far from over. Every explosion leaves wreckage, and the fallout from this one would reshape the monarchy in ways none of them could control. The blast of Jewelgate sent shockwaves far beyond Buckingham's gates. When the tabloid headline hit, the monarchy found itself standing on fragile ground. Its reputation cracked like shattered crystal. The jewels might have been locked away again, but the damage to trust could not be contained. The first wave of fallout came in numbers. Polling in the days after the scandal broke revealed brutal statistics. 82% of Britons sided with Anne's account of events, while only 11% said they believed Camilla's denials. The Queen Consort's approval ratings plunged into single digits, the lowest ever recorded for a senior royal in modern times. By contrast, Anne's popularity soared. Newspapers that once relegated her to the margins now hailed her as the monarchy's iron guardian, the daughter who defended her mother's memory when others faltered. Support for Catherine grew in tandem. Images of her wearing Diana's jewels in happier years circulated online, framed as proof of her respect for tradition and legacy. In the eyes of the public, she too had become part of the story, not as a scandal's subject, but as its moral compass. In contrast, memes mocking Camilla flooded social media. Doctored images of her stuffing tiaras into shopping bags, captions accusing her of turning the crown into a pawn shop. The ridicule was relentless, and each viral post stripped away another layer of the dignity her title once bestowed. Inside the palace, the atmosphere curdled into open fracture. Courtiers who had long orbited around Camilla quietly drifted away, redirecting their loyalty toward William and Catherine's household. Clarence House, once alive with bustle, fell eerily silent. Even senior aides began avoiding her calls, fearful of being tainted by association.